Don't mind the typing. I'm just running a little bit behind. Hey, little dude. Yes, so much clackety clack. I actually wasn't running behind until I was thinking about adding pictures of Kana to the Discord. And I got caught up looking at the super cute puppy. So I hope you'll forgive me for taking just a moment to typey. How is everyone today? Hope everyone's having a good evening. Only forgiven if I produce the pictures. Okay, I'm trying. They're so cute. She was super cute today. She wanted some of my breakfast in the worst way. I've actually got one picture where she's got the drool reins going, like they're hanging down like reins for horses. But she's even got a little tear building in the corner of her eye because she wants me to know how much she wants the noms. She wants them so much. It is so cute. Oh. She is, though. Oh, wait. No, I'm going back to that. 1 second. I want a question for 8 Ball. All right. 8 Ball. Is there a cuter puppy than Kana? Let's see if 8 Ball gets it right. Oh. All right, fine. It's later. We're going to ask again. No! Betrayed. Yeah, it's time for some calibration, 8 Ball. Yeah. Me and 8 Ball, we're going to have words. Yep. All the words. Eight Ball got sass. You've infected it, Vela. I blame you for this. Totally your fault. All right. Wow. Pictures of Kana will be in the Where the Fluffy Things Are channel in the Discord. So if you are listening to this and you haven't joined the Discord yet, you should absolutely do so. There are links all over the place. They're here, they're everywhere. There's links on the screen right now. There's links in the Discord channel. There's links on the page on Twitch below the stream. They're everywhere. So please, click it, join it, hang out with us, post pictures of your fluffies, see pictures of our fluffies, hang out with the wonderful people in the stream, witness the ultimate troll bot as programmed by Random and Vela, who are still going to get it. They won't know when it's coming because I don't know when I'm going to get them. And they won't know what it is because I haven't figured it out yet. But I'm going to get them. Just you wait. All right. So today we are going back to Nicholas Nickleby by Charles Dickens. Last we had read Newman Noggs. He reminds me of have any of you read Discworld? Anybody a Terry Pratchett fan in here? Anybody? Crickets. I know I'm so impatient with the chat replies, right? I probably have a delay set on the stream so you guys hear me like after I ask. And so I gotta wait for that stream delay. But anyway, there is a character in the... kill it. Kill it. Time to go away, you. Goodbye. Well, I am sorry for being impatient. Also, the spam bot is dead. Need to find if I can find like a auto ban for anybody who uses big follows. Big follows equals ban. All right. So there's a character in Discworld in the Guard series called Nobby Noggs, and he's an interesting fellow, a little bit malformed, kind of. It makes me think that Pratchett read Dickens and based Nobby Noggs on Newman Noggs, because there's a lot of similarities there. Although Newman Noggs definitely has more of a nobility to him, I think, than Nobby Noggs. But in any case, Newman Noggs was at a small dinner party, and he was interrupted late by visitors asking for him on his step. And it was two individuals. I believe the author's hinting that they are likely Smike and Nicholas, because they've traveled to London on foot and in the cold and the wet and whatnot. So we shall find out what occurred as they left us kind of hanging without identifying them at the end of the last chapter. They left the Dothboys Hall because Mike was getting beaten severely and Nicholas wouldn't stand for it any further and beat Mr. Squeers, the headmaster of Dothboys Hall, after utterly tearing Squeers' daughter down in public in the road, explaining just how much he was not into her. So, Chapter 15 acquaints the reader with the cause and origin of the interruption described in the last chapter, and with some other matters necessary to be known. Very, very mechanistic chapter description there. Newman Noggs scrambled in violent haste upstairs with the steaming beverage, which he had so unceremoniously snatched from the table of Mr. Kinwig's, and indeed from the very grasp of the water rate collector, who was eyeing the contents of the tumbler at the moment of its unexpected abstraction with lively marks of pleasure visible in his countenance. He bore his prize straight to his own back garret, where, Footsore and nearly shoeless, wet, dirty, jaded, and disfigured with every mark of fatiguing travel, sat Nicholas and Smike, at once the cause and partner of his toil, both perfectly worn out by their unwonted and protracted exertion. Newman's first act was to compel Nicholas, with gentle force, to swallow half of the punch at a breath, nearly boiling as it was, and his next to pour the remainder down the throat of Smike, who, never having tasted anything stronger than aperient medicine in his whole life, exhibited various odd manifestations of surprise and delight during the passage of the liquor down his throat, and turned up his eyes most emphatically when it was all gone. "You are wet through," said Newman, passing his hand hastily over the coat which Nicholas had thrown off. "And I haven't even a change," he added, with a wistful glance at the shabby clothes he wore himself. "I have dry clothes, or at least such as will serve my turn well, in my bundle," replied Nicholas. "If you look so distressed to see me, you will add to the pain I feel already, at being compelled, for one night, to cast myself upon your slender means for aid and shelter." Newman did not look the less distressed to hear Nicholas talking in this strain, but, upon his young friend grasping him heartily by the hand, and assuring him that nothing but implicit confidence in the sincerity of his professions and kindness of feeling toward himself would have induced him, on any consideration, even to have made him acquainted with his arrival in London, Mr. Noggs brightened up again, and went about making such arrangements as were in his power for the comfort of his visitors, with extreme alacrity. These were simple enough, poor Newman's means halting at a very considerable distance short of his inclinations. But, slight as they were not made without much bustling and running about. As Nicholas has husbanded his scanty stock of money, so well it was not quite yet expended, a supper of bread and cheese, with some cold beef from the cook's shop, was soon placed upon the table, and these viands being flanked by a bottle of spirits and a pot of porter, there was no ground for apprehension on the score of hunger or thirst, at all events. Such preparations as Newman had it in his power to make for the accommodation of his guest during the night occupied no very great time in completing, and, as he had insisted, as an express oh my God, the words are hard today. As an express preliminary, that Nicholas should change his clothes, and that Smike should invest himself in his solitary coat, which no entreaties would dissuade him from stripping off for the purpose. The travelers partook of their frugal fare with more satisfaction than one of them at least had derived from many a better meal. Oh, we're going to try pouring the tea. It is very hot, and I am once again wearing the pullover from before. I haven't worn it since. Once bitten, twice shy, and all that. All right. Then they drew near the fire, which Newman Noggs had made up as well as he could, after the inroads of Crowle upon the fuel. And Nicholas, who had hitherto been restrained by the extreme anxiety of his friend that he should refresh himself after his journey, now pressed him with earnest questions concerning his mother and sister. "Well," replied Newman, with his accustomed taciturnity, "both well." "They are living in the city still?" inquired Nicholas. "They are," said Newman. "And my sister," added Nicholas, "is she still engaged in the business which she wrote to tell me she thought she should like so much?" Newman opened his eyes rather wider than usual, but merely replied by a gasp, which, according to the action of the head that accompanied it, was interpreted by his friends as meaning yes or no. In the present instance, the pantomime consisted of a nod and not a shake, so Nicholas took the answer as a favorable one. "Now listen to me," said Nicholas, laying his hand on Newman's shoulder. "Before I would make an effort to see them, I deemed it expedient to come to you, lest, by gratifying my own selfish desire, I should inflict an injury upon them which I can never repair. What has my uncle heard from Yorkshire?" Newman opened and shut his mouth several times, as though he were trying his utmost to speak, but could make nothing of it, and finally fixed his eyes on Nicholas with a grim and ghastly stare. "What has he heard?" urged Nicholas, coloring. "You see that I am prepared to hear the very worst that malice could have suggested. Why should you conceal it from me? I must know it sooner or later, and what purpose can be gained by trifling with the matter for a few minutes, when half the time would put me in possession of all that has occurred? Tell me at once, pray." Oops. Boop. Okay. Thank you. Sorry. My bad. "Tomorrow morning," said Newman. "Hear it tomorrow." "What purpose would that answer?" urged Nicholas. "You would sleep better," replied Newman. "I should sleep the worse," answered Nicholas impatiently. "Sleep, exhausted as I am, and standing in no common need of rest. I cannot hope to close my eyes all night, unless you tell me everything." "And if I should tell you everything," said Newman, hesitating. "Why, then you may rouse my indignation or wound my pride," rejoined Nicholas, "but you will not break my rest. For if the scene were acted over again, I could have taken no other part than I have taken, and whatever consequences may accrue to myself from it, I shall never regret doing as I have done. Never, if I starve or beg in consequence. What is a little poverty or suffering to the disgrace of the basest and most inhuman cowardice? I tell you, if I had stood by tamely and passively, I should have hated myself and merited the contempt of every man in existence, the black-hearted scoundrel." With this gentle allusion to the absent Mr. Squeers, Nicholas repressed his rising wrath, and relating to Newman exactly what had passed at Dotheboys Hall, entreated him to speak out without more pressing. Thus adjured, Mr. Noggs took from an old trunk a sheet of paper, which appeared to have been scrawled over in great haste, and after sundry extraordinary demonstrations of reluctance, delivered himself in the following terms. "My dear young man, you mustn't give way to— this sort of thing will never do, you know, as to getting on in the world, if you take everybody's part that's ill-treated. Damn it, I am proud to hear of it, and would have done it myself." Newman accompanied this very unusual outbreak with a violent blow upon the table, as if, in the heat of the moment, he had mistaken it for the chest or ribs of Mr. Wackford Squeers. Having, by this open declaration of his feelings, quite precluded himself from offering Nicholas any cautious worldly advice, which had been his first intention, Mr. Noggs went straight to the point. "The day before yesterday," said Newman, "your uncle received this letter. I took a hasty copy of it while he was out. Shall I read it?" "If you please," replied Nicholas. Newman Noggs accordingly read as follows. "Dotheboys Hall, Thursday morning. Sir, my pa requests me to write to you. The doctors considering it doubtful whether he will ever recover the use of his legs, which prevents his holding a pen. Okay. We are in a state of mind beyond everything, and my paw is one mask of bruises, both blue and green likewise. 2 forms are steepled in his gore. We were compelled to have him carried down into the kitchen, where he now lays. You will judge from this that he has been brought very low." By the way, the spelling in this is atrocious. "When your nephew that you recommended for a teacher had done this to my paw, and jumped upon his body with his feet, and also language which I will not pollute my pen with describing, he assaulted my ma with dreadful violence, dashed her to the earth, and drove her back comb several inches into her head. A very little more, and it must have entered her skull. We have a medical certificate that if it had, the tortoiseshell would have affected the brain. Me and my brother were then victims of his fury, since which we have suffered very much, which leads us to the arrowing belief that we have received some injury in our insides, especially as no marks of violence are visible externally. I am screaming out loud all the time I write, and so is my brother, which takes off my attention rather, and I hope will excuse mistakes. The monster, having satiated his thirst, and I'm not mispronouncing, I'm pronouncing as written as best I can. The monster, having satiated his thirst for blood, ran away, taking with him a boy of desperate character that he had excited to rebellion, and a garnet ring belonging to my ma, and not having been apprehended by the constables, is supposed to have been took up by some stagecoach. My pa begs that if he comes to you, the ring may be returned, and that you will let the thief and assassin go, as if we prosecuted him he would only be transported, and if he is let go he is sure to be hung before long, which will save us trouble and be much more satisfactory. Hoping to hear from you when convenient, I remain yours and cetera, Fanny Squares. P.S. I pity his ignorance and despise him. A profound silence succeeded to the reading of this choice epistle, during which Newman Noggs, as he folded it up, gazed with a kind of grotesque pity at the boy of desperate character therein referred to, who, having no more distinct perception of the matter in hand than that he had been the unfortunate cause of heaping trouble and falsehood upon Nicholas, sat mute and dispirited, with a most woebegone and heart-stricken look. "Mr. Noggs," said Nicholas, after a few moments' reflection, "I must go out at once." "Go out?" cried Newman. "Yes," said Nicholas, "to Golden Square. Nobody who knows me would believe the story of the ring, but it may suit the purpose or gratify the hatred of Mr. Ralph Nickleby to feign to attach credence to it. It is due, not to him, but to myself, that I should state the truth, and moreover, I have a word or two to exchange with him, which will not keep cool." "They must," said Newman. "They must not, indeed," rejoined Nicholas firmly, as he prepared to leave the house. "Hear me speak," said Newman, planting himself before his impetuous young friend. "He is not there. He is away from town. He will not be back for 3 days, and I know that letter will not be answered before he returns." "Are you sure of this?" asked Nicholas, chafing violently, and pacing the narrow room with rapid strides. "Quite," rejoined Newman. "He had hardly read it when he was called away. Its contents are known to nobody but himself and us." "Are you certain?" demanded Nicholas precipitately. "Not even to my mother or sister? If I thought that they— I will go there. I must see them. Which is the way? Where is it?" "Now, be advised by me," said Newman, speaking for the moment in his earnestness, like any other man. "Make no effort to see even them till he comes home. I know the man. Do not seem to have been tampering with anybody. When he returns, go straight to him and speak as boldly as you like. Guessing at the real truth, he knows it as well as you or I. Trust him for that." "You mean well to me, and should know him better than I can," replied Nicholas, after some consideration. "Well, let it be so." Newman, who had stood during the foregoing conversation with his back planted against the door, ready to oppose any egress from the apartment by force if necessary, resumed his seat with much satisfaction, and as the water in the kettle was by this time boiling, made a glassful of spirits and water for Nicholas, and a cracked mugful for the joint accommodation of himself and Smike, of which the two partook in great harmony, while Nicholas, leaning his head upon his hand, remained buried in melancholy meditation. Meanwhile, the company below stairs, after listening attentively and not hearing any noise which would justify them in interfering for the gratification of their curiosity, returned to the chamber of the Kinswiggses, and employed themselves in hazarding a great variety of conjectures relative to the cause of Mr. Noggs' sudden disappearance and detention. "Lor, I'll tell you what," said Mrs. Kinnewiggs. "Suppose it should be an express sent up to say that his property has all come back again." "Dear me," said Mr. Kinnewiggs, "it's not impossible. Perhaps in that case we'd better send up and ask if he won't take a little more punch." "Kenwiggs," said Mr. Lillyvick in a loud voice, "I am surprised at you." "What's the matter, sir?" asked Mr. Kenwiggs, with becoming submission to the collector of water rates. "Making such a remark as that, sir," replied Mr. Lillyvick angrily. "He has had punch already, has he not, sir? I consider the way in which that punch was cut off, if I may use the expression, highly disrespectful to this company. Scandalous, perfectly scandalous. It may be the custom to allow such things in this house, but it's not the kind of behavior that I've been used to see displayed, and so I don't mind telling you, Kinwigs. A gentleman has a glass of punch before him, to which he is just about to set his lips, when another gentleman comes and collars that glass of punch, without a 'with your leave' or 'by your leave,' and carries that glass of punch away. This may be good manners. I dare say it is, but I don't understand it, that's all. And what's more, I don't care if I never do. It's my way to speak my mind, Kinwigs, and that is my mind. And if you don't like it, it's past my regular time for going to bed, and I can find my way home without making it later. Here was an untoward event. The collector had sat swelling and fuming in offended dignity for some minutes, and had now fairly burst out. The great man, the rich relation, the unmarried uncle, who had it in his power to make Morlina an heiress, and the very baby a legatee, was offended. Gracious powers, where was this to end? "I'm very sorry, sir," said Mr. Kinwigs humbly. "Don't tell me you're sorry," retorted Mr. Lillyvick, with much sharpness. "You should have prevented it, then." The company was quite paralyzed by this domestic crash. The back parlor sat with her mouth wide open, staring vacantly at the collector, in a stupor of dismay. The other guests were scarcely less overpowered by the great man's irritation. Mr. Kinwigs, not being skilful in such matters, only fanned the flame in attempting to extinguish it. "I didn't think of it, I am sure, sir," said that gentleman. "I didn't suppose that such a little thing as a glass of punch would have put you out of temper." "Out of temper? What the devil do you mean by that piece of impertinence, Mr. Kinwigs?" said the collector. "Morlina, child, give me my hat." "Oh, you're not going, Mr. Lillyvick, sir," interposed Miss Petowker, with her most bewitching smile. But still, Mr. Lillyvick, regardless of the siren, cried obdurately, "Morlina, my hat!" Upon the fourth repetition of which demand, Mrs. Kinwigs sunk back in her chair, with a cry that might have softened a water butt, but not to say a water collector, while the four little girls, privately instructed to that effect, clasped their uncle's drab shorts in their arms, and prayed him, in imperfect English, to remain. "Why should I stop here, my dear?" said Mr. Lillyvick. "I am not wanted here." "Oh, do not speak so cruelly, uncle," sobbed Mrs. Kinwigs, "unless you wish to kill me." "I shouldn't wonder if some people were to say I did," replied Mr. Lillyvick, glancing angrily at Kinwigs. "Out of temper." "Oh, I cannot bear to see him look so at my husband," cried Miss Kinwigs. "It's so dreadful in families. Oh!" "Mr. Lillyvick," said Kinwigs, "I hope, for the sake of your niece, that you won't object to be reconciled." The collector's features relaxed as the company added their entreaties to those of his nephew-in-law. He gave up his hat and held out his hand. "There, Kinwigs," said Mr. Lillyvick, "and let me tell you, at the same time, to show you how much out of temper I was, that if I had gone away without another word, it would have made no difference respecting that £1 or £2 which I shall leave among your children when I die." "Morlina Kinwigs," cried her mother in a torrent of affection, "go down upon your knees to your dear uncle, and beg him to love you all his life through, for he's more an angel than a man, and I've always said so." Oh, man, these characters kiss ass a lot. Miss Morlina, approaching to do homage, in compliance with this injunction, was summarily caught up and kissed by Mr. Lillyvick, and thereupon Mrs. Kinwigs darted forward and kissed the collector. An irrepressible murmur of applause broke from the company, who had witnessed his magnanimity. The worthy gentleman then became once more the life and soul of the society, being again reinstated in his old post of lion, from which high station the temporary distraction of their thoughts had for a moment dispossessed him. Quadruped lions are said to be savage, but only when they are hungry. Biped lions are rarely sulky longer than when their appetite for distinction remains unappeased. Mr. Lillyvick stood higher than ever, for he had shown his power, hinted at his property and testamentary intentions, gained great credit for disinterestedness and virtue, and in addition to all, was finally accommodated with a much larger tumbler of punch than that which Newman Noggs had so feloniously made off with. "I say, I beg everyone's pardon for intruding again," said Crowell, looking in at this happy juncture. "But what a queer business this is, isn't it? Noggs has lived in this house, now going on for 5 years, and nobody has ever been to see him before, within the memory of the oldest inhabitant." "It's a strange time of night to be called away, sir, certainly," said the collector, "and the behavior of Mr. Noggs himself is, to say the least of it, mysterious." "Well, so it is," rejoined Crowell, "and I'll tell you what's more. I think these two geniuses, whoever they are, have run away from somewhere." "What makes you think that, sir?" demanded the collector, who seemed, by a tacit understanding, to have been chosen an elected mouthpiece to the company. "You have no reason to suppose that they have run away from anywhere without paying the rates and taxes due, I hope." Mr. Crowell, with a look of some contempt, was about to enter a general protest against the payment of rates or taxes under any circumstances, when he was checked by a timely whisper from Kenwigs, and several frowns and winks from Mrs. K., which providentially stopped him. "Why, the fact is," said Crowell, who had been listening at Newman's door with all his might and main, "the fact is that they have been talking so loud that they quite disturbed me in my room, and so I couldn't help catching a word here and a word there, and all I heard certainly seems to refer to their having bolted from some place or other. I don't wish to alarm Mrs. Kenwigs, but I hope they haven't come from any jail or hospital, and brought away a fever or some unpleasantness of that sort which might be catching for the children." Mrs. Kenwigs was so overpowered by this supposition that it needed all the tender attentions of Miss Petoker of the Theatre Royal, Drury Lane, to restore her to anything like a state of calmness, not to mention the assiduity of Mr. Kenwigs, who held a fat-smelling bottle to his lady's nose, until it became a matter of some doubt whether the tears which coursed down her face were the result of feelings or sal volatile. The ladies, having expressed their sympathy singly and separately, fell according to custom into a little chorus of soothing expressions, among which such condolences as "Poor dear! I should feel just the same if I was her. To be sure, it's a very trying thing, and nobody but a mother knows what a mother's feelings is," were among the most prominent and most frequently repeated. In short, the opinion of the company was so clearly manifested that Mr. Kenwigs was on the point of repairing to Mr. Noggs' room to demand an explanation, and had indeed swallowed a preparatory glass of punch, with great inflexibility and steadiness of purpose, when the attention of all present was diverted by a new and terrible surprise. This was nothing less than the sudden pouring forth of a rapid succession of the shrillest and most piercing screams from an upper story, and to all appearance from the very two-pair back, in which the infant Kenwigs was at that moment enshrined. They were no sooner audible than Mrs. Kenwigs, opining that a strange cat had come in and sucked the baby's breath while the girl was asleep, made for the door, wringing her hands and shrieking dismally, to the great consternation and confusion of the company. "Mr. Kenwigs, see what it is! Make haste!" cried the sister, laying violent hands upon Mrs. Kenwigs and holding her back by force. "Oh, don't twist about so, dear, or I can never hold you." "My baby, my blessed, 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 blessed baby!" screamed Mrs. Kenwigs, making every blessed louder than the last. "My own darling, sweet, innocent Lillyvick! Oh, let me go to him! Let me go!" Pending the utterance of these frantic cries, and the wails and lamentations of the four little girls, Mr. Kenwigs rushed upstairs to the room whence the sounds proceeded, at the door of which he encountered Nicholas, with the child in his arms, who darted out with such violence that the anxious father was thrown down 6 stairs and alighted on the nearest landing-place, before he had found time to open his mouth to ask what was the matter. "Don't be alarmed," cried Nicholas, running down. "Here it is. It's all out. It's all over. Pray compose yourselves. There's no harm done." And with these, and 1,000 other assurances, he delivered the baby, whom in his hurry he had carried upside down, to Mrs. Kenwigs, and ran back to assist Mr. Kenwigs, who was rubbing his head very hard and looking much bewildered by his tumble. Reassured by this cheering intelligence, the company in some degree recovered from their fears, which had been productive of some of the most singular instances of a total want of presence of mind. Thus, the bachelor friend had, for a long time, supported in his arms Mrs. Kenwig's sister instead of Mrs. Kenwigs, and the worthy Mr. Lillyvick had been actually seen, in the perturbation of his spirits, to kiss Miss Petoker several times behind the room door, as calmly as if nothing distressing was going forward. "It is a mere nothing," said Nicholas, returning to Mrs. Kenwigs. The little girl, who was watching the child, being tired, I suppose, fell asleep and set her hair on fire. "Oh, you malicious little wretch," cried Mrs. Kinnywiggs, impressively shaking her forefinger at the small unfortunate, who might be 13 years old, and was looking on with a singed head and a frightened face. "I heard her cries," continued Nicholas, "and ran down, in time to prevent her setting fire to anything else. You may depend upon it that the child is not hurt, for I took it off the bed myself and brought it here to convince you." This brief explanation over, the infant, who, as he was christened after the collector, rejoiced in the names of Lillyvick Kinwiggs, was partially suffocated under the caress of the audience, and squeezed to his mother's bosom until he roared again. The attention of the company was then directed, by a natural transition, to the little girl who had had the audacity to burn her hair off, and who, after receiving sundry small slaps and pushes from the more energetic of the ladies, was mercifully sent home, the 9 pence with which she was to have been rewarded being escheated to the Kinwiggs family. "And whatever we are to say to you, sir," exclaimed Mrs. Kinwiggs, addressing young Lillyvick's deliverer, "I am sure I don't know." "You need say nothing at all," replied Nicholas. "I have done nothing to found any very strong claim upon your eloquence, I am sure." "He might have been burnt to death if it hadn't been for you, sir," simpered Miss Petowker. "Not very likely, I think," replied Nicholas, for there was abundance of assistance here, which must have reached him before he had been in any danger. "You will let us drink your health anyways, sir," said Mr. Kinwiggs, motioning toward the table. "In my absence, by all means," rejoined Nicholas, with a smile. "I have had a very fatiguing journey, and should be most indifferent company. A far greater check upon your merriment than a promoter of it, even if I kept awake, which I think very doubtful. If you will allow me, I'll return to my friend Mr. Noggs, who went upstairs again when he found nothing serious had occurred. Good night." Excusing himself in these terms from joining in the festivities, Nicholas took a most winning farewell of Mrs. Kinnywiggs and the other ladies, and retired after making a very extraordinary impression upon the company. "What a delightful young man!" cried Mrs. Kinnywiggs. "Uncommon gentlemanly, really," said Mr. Kinwiggs. "Don't you think so, Mr. Lillyvick?" "Yes," said the collector, with a dubious shrug of his shoulders. "He is gentlemanly, very gentlemanly, in appearance." "I hope you don't see anything against him, uncle?" inquired Mrs. Kinwiggs. "No, my dear," replied the collector. "No. I trust he may not turn out, well. No matter. My love to you, my dear, and long life to the baby." "Your namesake," said Mrs. Kinwiggs, with a sweet smile. "And I hope a worthy namesake," observed Mr. Kinwiggs, willing to propitiate the collector. "I hope a baby as will never disgrace his godfather, and as may be considered, in arter years, of a piece with the Lillyvicks whose name he bears. I do say, and Mrs. Kinnywiggs is of the same sentiment, and feels it as strong as I do, that I consider his being called Lillyvick one of the greatest blessings and honours of my existence." "The greatest blessing," Kinwiggs murmured his lady. "The greatest blessing," said Mr. Kinwiggs, correcting himself. "A blessing that I hope one of these days I may be able to deserve." This was a politic stroke of the Kinwiggses, because it made Mr. Lillyvick the great head and fountain of the baby's importance. The good gentleman felt the delicacy and dexterity of the touch, and at once proposed the health of the gentleman, name unknown, who had signalized himself that night by his coolness and alacrity. "Who, I don't mind saying," observed Mr. Lillyvick, as a great concession, "is a good-looking young man enough, with manners that I hope his character may be equal to." "He has a very nice face and style, really," said Mrs. Kinnywiggs. "He certainly has," added Miss Petowker. "There's something in his appearance quite— Dear, what's that word again?" "What word?" inquired Mr. Lillyvick. "Why, dear me, how stupid I am," replied Miss Petowker, hesitating. "What do you call it, when lords break off door-knockers and beat policemen, and play at coaches with other people's money, and all that sort of thing?" "Aristocratic," suggested the collector. "Ah, aristocratic," replied Miss Petowker. "Something very aristocratic about him, isn't there?" The gentlemen held their peace and smiled at each other, as who should say, "Well, there's no accounting for tastes." But the ladies resolved unanimously that Nicholas had an aristocratic air, and nobody caring to dispute the position, it was established triumphantly. The punch being by this time drunk out, and the little Kinswigses, who had for some time previously held their little eyes open with their little forefingers, becoming fractious and requesting rather urgently to be put to bed. The collector made a move by pulling out his watch and acquainting the company that it was nigh on 2:00, whereat some of the guests were surprised and others shocked, and hats and bonnets being groped for under the tables, and in course of time found, their owners went away, after a vast deal of shaking of hands and many remarks how they had never spent such a delightful evening, and how they marveled to find it so late, expecting to have heard that it was 10:30 at the very latest, and how they wished that Mr. and Mrs. Kennewigs had a wedding day once a week, and how they wondered by what hidden agency Mrs. Kennewigs could possibly have managed so well, and a great deal more of the same kind. To all of which flattering expressions Mr. and Mrs. Kennewigs replied by thanking every lady and gentleman seriatim for the favor of their company, and hoping they might have enjoyed themselves only half as well as they said they had. As to Nicholas, quite unconscious of the impression he had produced, he had long since fallen asleep, leaving Mr. Newman Noggs and Smike to empty the spirit bottle between them, and this office they performed with such extreme good will that Newman was equally at a loss to determine whether he himself was quite sober, and whether he had ever seen any gentleman so heavily, drowsily, and completely intoxicated as his new acquaintance. So Smike got roaring drunk, huh? Okay. Chapter 16. Yeah, we should have enough time before the intermission. The first care of Nicholas next morning. Nicholas seeks to employ himself in a new capacity, and being unsuccessful, accepts an engagement as tutor in a private family. The first care of Nicholas next morning was to look after some room in which, until better times dawned upon him, he could contrive to exist, without trenching upon the hospitality of Newman Noggs, who would have slept upon the stairs with pleasure, so that his young friend was accommodated. The vacant apartment, to which the bill in the parlor window bore reference, appeared on inquiry to be a small back room on the second floor, reclaimed from the leads and overlooking a soot-bespeckled prospect of tiles and chimney-pots. For the letting of this portion of the house from week to week, on reasonable terms, the parlor lodger was empowered to treat, he being deputed by the landlord to dispose of the rooms as they became vacant, and to keep a sharp lookout that the lodgers didn't run away. As a means of securing the punctual discharge of which last service, he was permitted to live rent-free, lest he should at any time be tempted to run away himself. Of this chamber, Nicholas became the tenant, and having hired a few common articles of furniture from a neighboring broker, and paid the first week's hire in advance, out of a small fund raised by the conversion of some spare clothes into ready money, he sat himself down to ruminate upon his prospects, which, like the prospect outside his window, were sufficiently confined and dingy. As they by no means improved on better acquaintance, and as familiarity breeds contempt, he resolved to banish them from his thoughts by dint of hard walking. So taking up his hat, and leaving poor Smike to arrange and rearrange the room with as much delight as if it had been the costliest palace, he betook himself to the streets, and mingled with the crowd which thronged them. Although a man may lose a sense of his own importance when he is a mere unit among a busy throng, all utterly regardless of him, it by no means follows that he can dispossess himself with equal facility of a very strong sense of the importance and magnitude of his cares. The unhappy state of his own affairs was the one idea which occupied the brain of Nicholas, walk as fast as he would, and when he tried to dislodge it by speculating on the situation and prospects of the people who surrounded him, he caught himself, in a few seconds, contrasting their condition with his own, and gliding almost imperceptibly back into his old train of thought again. So, basically, he's doing the Dickensian version of scrolling through Facebook trying to get distracted from being depressed and worried. At least that's how I read it. I imagine his way burns a few more calories, though. Occupied in these reflections, as he was making his way along one of the great public thoroughfares of London, he chanced to raise his eyes to a blue board, whereon was inscribed, in characters of gold, General Agency Office, for places and situations of all kinds, inquire within. It was a shop front, fitted up with a gauze blind and inner door, and in the window hung a long and tempting array of written placards, announcing vacant places of every grade, from a secretary's to a footboy's. Nicholas halted instinctively before this temple of promise, and ran his eye over the capital text openings in life which were so profusely displayed. When he had completed his survey, he walked on a little way, and then back, and then on again, at length, after pausing irresolutely several times before the door of the General Agency Office, he made up his mind and stepped in. He found himself in a little floor-clothed room with a high desk railed off in one corner, behind which sat a lean youth with cunning eyes and a protruding chin, whose performances in capital text darkened the window. He had a thick ledger lying open before him, and with the fingers of his right hand inserted between the leaves, and his eyes fixed on a very fat old lady in a mob cap, evidently the proprietress of the establishment, who was airing herself at the fire, seemed to be only waiting her directions to refer to some entries contained within its rusty clasps. As there was a board outside which acquainted the public that servants of all work were perpetually in waiting to be hired from 10 till 4, Nicholas knew at once that some half-dozen strong young women, each with pattens and an umbrella, who were sitting upon a form in one corner, were in attendance for that purpose, especially as the poor things looked anxious and weary. He was not quite so certain of the callings and stations of two smart young ladies who were in conversation with the fat lady before the fire, until, having sat himself down in a corner, and remarked that he would wait until the other customers had been served, the fat lady resumed the dialogue which his entrance had interrupted. "Cook, Tom," said the fat lady, still airing herself as aforesaid. "Cook," said Tom, turning over some leaves of the ledger. "Well." "Read out an easy place or two," said the fat lady. "Pick out very light ones, if you please, young man," interposed a genteel female, in a shepherd's plaid boots, who appeared to be the client. "Mrs. Marker," said Tom, reading. "Russell Place, Russell Square. Offers 18 guineas, tea and sugar found. 2 in family and see very little company. 5 servants kept. No man, no followers." "Oh, Lord," tittered the client, "that won't do. Read another, young man, will you?" "Mrs. Rymug," said Tom. "Pleasant Place, Finsbury. Wages, 12 guineas. No tea, no sugar. Serious family." "Ah, you needn't mind reading that," interrupted the client. "3 serious footmen," said Tom impressively. "3, did you say?" asked the client in an altered tone. "3 serious footmen," replied Tom. "Cook, housemaid, and nursemaid. Each female servant required to join the Little Bethel congregation 3 times every Sunday, with a serious footman. If the cook is more serious than the footman, she will be expected to improve the footman. If the footman is more serious than the cook, he will be expected to improve the cook." Not sure what they mean exactly by serious in this context. Anybody have any ideas? "I'll take the address of that place," said the client. "I don't know but what it mightn't suit me pretty well." "Here's another," remarked Tom, turning over the leaves. "Family of Mr. Gallenbeal, M.P. 15 guineas, tea and sugar, and servants allowed to see male cousins, if godly. Note, cold dinner in the kitchen on the Sabbath. Mr. Gallenbeal being devoted to the observance question. No victuals whatever cooked on the Lord's Day, with the exception of dinner for Mr. and Mrs. Gallenbeal, which, being a work of piety and necessity, is exempted. Mr. Gallenbeal dines late on the day of rest, in order to prevent the sinfulness of the cook's dressing herself." "I don't think that'll answer as well as the other," said the client, after a little whispering with her friend. "I'll take the other direction, if you please, young man. I can but come back again, if it don't do." Tom made out the address, as requested, and the genteel client, having satisfied the fat lady with a small fee, meanwhile went away accompanied by her friend. As Nicholas opened his mouth to request the young man to turn to letter S and let him know what secretaryships remained undisposed of, there came into the office an applicant, in whose favor he immediately retired, and whose appearance both surprised and interested him. This was a young lady who could scarcely be 18, of very slight and delicate figure, but exquisitely shaped, who, walking timidly up to the desk, made an inquiry in a very low tone of voice, relative to some situation as governess or companion to a lady. She raised her veil for an instant, while she preferred the inquiry, and disclosed a countenance of most uncommon beauty, though shaded by a cloud of sadness, which in one so young was doubly remarkable. Having received a card of reference to some person on the books, she made the usual acknowledgment and glided away. Uh-oh. I think Nicholas is smitten. She was neatly, but very quietly attired, so much so, indeed, that it had seemed as though her dress, if it had been worn by one who imparted fewer graces of her own to it, might have looked poor and shabby. Her attendant, for she had one, was a red-faced, round-eyed, slovenly girl, who, from a certain roughness about the bare arms that peeped from under her dragged shawl, and the half-washed-out traces of smut and black lead which tattooed her countenance, was clearly of a kin with the servants of all work on the form, between whom and herself there had passed various grins and glances, indicative of the freemasonry of the craft. This girl followed her mistress, and before Nicholas had recovered from the first effects of his surprise and admiration, the young lady was gone. It is not a matter of such complete and utter improbability as some sober people may think, that he would have followed them out had he not been restrained by what passed between the fat lady and her bookkeeper. "When is she coming again, Tom?" asked the fat lady. "Tomorrow morning," replied Tom, mending his pen. "Where have you sent her to?" asked the fat lady. "Mrs. Clark's," replied Tom. "She'll have a nice life of it if she goes there," observed the fat lady, taking a pinch of snuff from a tin box. Tom made no other reply than thrusting his tongue into his cheek and pointing the feather of his pen toward Nicholas, reminders which elicited from the fat lady an inquiry of, "Now, sir, what can we do for you?" Nicholas briefly replied that he wanted to know whether there was any such post to be had as secretary or amunesis to a gentleman. "Any such," rejoined the mistress. "A dozen such, ain't there, Tom?" "I should think so," answered that young gentleman, and as he said it, he winked toward Nicholas, with a degree of familiarity which he, no doubt, intended for a rather flattering compliment, but with which Nicholas was most ungratefully disgusted. Upon reference to the book, it appeared that the dozen secretaryships had dwindled down to one. Mr. Gregsbury, the great member of Parliament of Manchester Buildings, Westminster, wanted a young man to keep his papers and correspondence in order, and Nicholas was exactly the sort of young man that Mr. Gregsbury wanted. "I don't know what the terms are, as he said he'd settle them himself with the party," observed the fat lady, "but they must be pretty good ones, because he's a member of Parliament." Inexperienced as he was, Nicholas did not feel quite assured of the force of this reasoning, or the justice of this conclusion. But without troubling himself to question it, he took down the address, and resolved to wait upon Mr. Gregsbury without delay. "I don't know what the number is," said Tom, "but Manchester Buildings isn't a large place, and if the worst comes to the worst, it won't take you very long to knock at all the doors on both sides of the way, till you find him out. I say, what a good-looking gal that was, wasn't she?" "What girl?" demanded Nicholas sternly. "Oh, yes, I know. What gal, eh?" whispered Tom, shutting one eye and cocking his chin in the air. "You didn't see her, you didn't. I say, don't you wish you was me when she comes tomorrow morning?" Nicholas looked at the ugly clerk, as if he had a mind to reward his admiration of the young lady by beating the ledger about his ears, but he refrained, and strode haughtily out of the office, setting at defiance in his indignation those ancient laws of chivalry, which not only made it proper and lawful for all good knights to hear the praise of the ladies to whom they were devoted, but rendered it incumbent upon them to roam about the world and knock at head all such matter-of-fact and unpoetical characters as declined to exalt above all the earth damsels whom they had never chanced to look upon or hear of, as if that were any excuse. Clearly Nicholas is a little too red and a little too underexperienced. But I think we figured that out already. thinking no longer of his own misfortunes, but wondering what could be those of the beautiful girl he had seen. Nicholas, with many wrong turns and many inquiries, and almost as many misdirections, bent his steps toward the place whither he had been directed. Within the precincts of the ancient city of Westminster, he's more creepy, more innocent and less creepy than Hastings, I think. Although we're not going to be able to finish this chapter before the break, so that's actually probably a good place to call an intermission. I need to take off my pullover anyway. After half a pot of tea, I get a little too warm with it. So yeah, let's do a tea break. Hopefully this time I won't forget to transition the screen. Alright, taking the headset off for just a second. Okay. So, honestly, what do you guys think of the story? Are you enjoying it? Like the writing and the language style and all that? Because I confess, of the various books that we've read, this is not my favorite. Dickens is a great author and all, but it's just, at first I was really enjoying the sarcasm and the puncturing of the various archetypes, but it's so relentless. It never lets up, and I don't know, it's in some ways, at least that's how I'm reading it, that's how I'm interpreting it, the constant mocking of everyone seems to get in the way of the telling of the story. So I don't know, that's just my thoughts on it. What do you guys think? Any opinions? Do you like it? Do you not like it? Would it be better to do something else in this time slot? I mean, I know I said I'd feel guilty leaving Nicholas with Mr. Squeers, but frankly, he's no longer with Mr. Squeers. We're at 23%. So if we continue, we're looking at probably a month and a half more, maybe 2 months more. Like probably 6 to 8 more sessions at least. Right, and I don't want to just abandon a book, but at the same time, if I'm not enjoying it and you guys aren't enjoying it, then perhaps something else might be better. It's a very lengthy book. Right, and neither do I. I really don't. And I've read much worse books simply for the sake of finishing the story. But at the same time, this one isn't... I mean, let's take a look at what the views are on this one, shall we? go to our video producer. All right, so let's see. And these aren't the live views. These are the other ones. 29 views for last week's, so in a week's time. Whereas Agatha Christie, in the last few days, has gotten 51, and yesterday's stream of Lovecraft already has 23. So in a week, hasn't gotten as many, or has gotten only barely more views than Lovecraft got in less than 24 hours. What did 8 Ball see? I wasn't looking at the screen. On the other hand, the one from 2 weeks back got 54 views, but it's also the one where you guys broke me with the Patreon donations when we opened that up, which is still incredible, and I'm still incredibly grateful for. You guys are amazing. Speaking of, this might be a good time to mention it. We've had a couple of new follows and new Patreons. Panda Witch became a subscriber, which is amazing. Thank you so much, Panda. She's a tier 2 subscriber. We had a couple new followers. Fat Cat Crossing, Anna Rusalka, Rebop, and Lady Luna Star have all followed in the past couple of days. These were all ones that occurred off stream, so I didn't get a chance to acknowledge them on stream. But thank you, all of you, for the follows and the new subscription. And if you're listening either to this or to the recording, please join the Discord if you want to support the stream. We're looking for people to help share the stream with others and bring more eyeballs to it, help our discoverability. And if you want to support the stream financially and defray some of the costs of doing it, or support me so that I can keep doing this and add more content, then the Patreon link is there on the screen, or it's in the Twitch. It's also in the Discord if you join the Discord. If you are watching this after broadcast and you have thoughts on whether we look at transitioning to another book or if we continue with Nicholas Nickleby, the Discord is a great place to give that feedback. I would love to hear from you, especially if you've just been kind of lurking up to this point and listening but not letting us know your thoughts and feelings. Please join the Discord, jump in, tell us how you feel, and weigh in on this discussion. For now, unless there is strong feeling, I'm planning on just continuing the book and finishing it, because, as I said, I don't like leaving books unfinished. But if there are a multitude of you who are against or not interested in the book or would simply prefer something else, then I will look at swapping in a new story in this time slot. Also, with the poetry, which I was supposed to read a poem starting today. My bad. Okay, so with the poetry and stuff, I am thinking of adding some new content strictly to the YouTube, where I add some poetry readings and short stories that aren't quite long enough for the broadcast, but will be good for some short form content to go with the 2-hour broadcasts on YouTube. So look for that in the coming weeks. I'll post links and stuff up when I get them up. And if you have any suggestions or requests for that, any favorite old poems or anything that you'd like to hear, please post them in the request channel in the Discord. All right. Well, so Kana Pictures absolved me from everything, huh? Okay, I can see that. Shall we go back to the story? Everyone back? Comfortable? Warm cup of tea? Refill mine. Today is Orange Pico. My standby and my regular. All right. Remembering to transition the screen. Look at that. You should take a picture of the box and link it in the chat. Maybe we need a channel for tea. I mean, in the Discord chat, not the stream chat. All right. Nicholas likes a girl, and we're hoping that he doesn't go full Hastings. Within the precincts of the ancient city of Westminster, and within half a quarter of a mile of its ancient sanctuary, is a narrow and dirty region, the sanctuary of the smaller members of Parliament in modern days. It is all comprised in one street of gloomy lodging houses, from whose windows, in vacation time, there frown long, melancholy rows of bills, which say, as plainly did the countenances of their occupiers, ranged on ministerial and opposition benches in the session which slumbers with its fathers, to let, to let. All right, that was savage. So I don't know if everybody caught that, but it's saying that the rooms are advertising that they can be rented for a fee, which he's saying is the exact same as the faces of the various ministers that rent them, that they are also for rent and can be bought out by various economic interests. What do you think? Does it remind you of politicians in your country? Whichever country you happen to be living in, putting themselves out for rent and sale to the highest bidder. I don't know. I think it's a surprisingly modern sentiment. In busier periods of the year, these bills disappear, and the houses swarm with legislators. There are legislators in the parlors, in the first floor, in the second, in the third, in the garrets. The small apartments reek with the breath of deputations and delegates. In damp weather, the place is rendered close by the steams of moist acts of Parliament and frowsy petitions. General postmen grow faint as they enter its infected limits, and shabby figures in quest of francs flit restlessly to and fro, like the troubled ghosts of complete letter-writers departed. This is Manchester Buildings, and here, at all hours of the night, may be heard the rattling of latchkeys in their respective keyholes, with now and then, when a gust of wind sweeping across the water which washes the building's feet, impels the sound towards its entrance, the weak, shrill voice of some young member practicing tomorrow's speech. All the livelong day, there is a grinding of organs and clashing and clanging of little boxes of music. For Manchester Buildings is an eel pot, which has no outlet but its awkward mouth, a case bottle which has no thoroughfare, and a short and narrow neck. And in this respect it may be typical of the fate of some few among its more adventurous residents, who, after wriggling themselves into Parliament by violent efforts and contortions, find that it, too, is no thoroughfare for them, that, like Manchester Buildings, it leads to nothing beyond itself, and that they are fain, at last, to back out, no wiser, no richer, not one whit more famous than they went in. Into Manchester Buildings Nicholas turned, with the address of the great Mr. Gregsbury in his hand. As there was a stream of people pouring into a shabby house not far from the entrance, he waited until they had made their way in, and then making up to the servant, ventured to inquire if he knew where Mr. Gregsbury lived. The servant was a very pale, shabby boy, who looked as if he had slipped underground from his infancy, as very likely he had. "Mr. Gregsbury," said he. "Mr. Gregsbury lodges here. It's all right. Come in." Nicholas thought he might as well get in while he could, so in he walked, and he had no sooner done so than the boy shut the door and made off. This was odd enough, but what was more embarrassing was that all along the passage and all along the narrow stairs, blocking up the window and making the dark entry darker still, was a confused crowd of persons with great importance depicted in their looks, who were, to all appearance, waiting in silent expectation of some coming event. From time to time, one man would whisper to his neighbor, or a little group would whisper together, and then the whisperers would nod fiercely to each other, or give their heads a relentless shake, as if they were bent upon doing something very desperate, and were determined not to be put off, whatever happened. As a few minutes elapsed without anything occurring to explain this phenomenon, and as he felt his own position a peculiarly uncomfortable one, Nicholas was on the point of seeking some information from the man next to him, when a sudden move was visible on the stairs, and a voice was heard to cry, "Now, gentlemen, have the goodness to walk up." So far from walking up, the gentleman on the stairs began to walk down with great alacrity, and to entreat, with extraordinary politeness, that the gentleman nearest the street would go first. The gentleman nearest the street retorted with equal courtesy that they couldn't think of such a thing on any account, but they did it without thinking of it, inasmuch as the other gentleman, pressing some half-dozen, among whom was Nicholas, forward, and closing up behind, pushed them, not merely up the stairs, but into the very sitting-room of Mr. Gregsbury, which they were thus compelled to enter with most unseemly precipitation, and without the means of retreat, the press behind them more than filling the apartment. "Gentlemen," said Mr. Gregsbury, "you are welcome. I am rejoiced to see you." For a gentleman who was rejoiced to see a body of visitors, Mr. Gregsbury looked as uncomfortable as might be, but perhaps this was occasioned by senatorial gravity and a statesmanlike habit of keeping his feelings under control. He was a tough, burly, thick-headed gentleman, with a loud voice, a pompous manner, a tolerable command of sentences with no meaning in them, and in short, every requisite for a very good member indeed. "Now, gentlemen," said Mr. Gregsbury, tossing a great bundle of papers into a wicker basket at his feet, and throwing himself back in his chair, with his arms over the elbows. "You are dissatisfied with my conduct, I see by the newspapers." "Yes, Mr. Gregsbury, we are," said a plump old gentleman in a violent heat, bursting out of the throng and planting himself in the front. "Do my eyes deceive me?" said Mr. Gregsbury, looking toward the speaker. "Or is that my old friend Pugstyles?" "I am that man and no other, sir," replied the plump old gentleman. "Give me your hand, my worthy friend," said Mr. Gregsbury. "Pugstyles, my dear friend, I am very sorry to see you here." "I am very sorry to be here, sir," said Mr. Pugstyles. "But your conduct, Mr. Gregsbury, has rendered this deputation from your constituents imperatively necessary." "My conduct, Miss Pugstyles?" said Mr. Gregsbury, looking round upon the deputation with gracious magnanimity. "My conduct has been, and ever will be, regulated by a sincere regard for the true and real interests of this great and happy country. Whether I look at home or abroad, whether I behold the peaceful, industrious communities of our island home, her rivers covered with steamboats, her roads with locomotives, her streets with cabs, her skies with balloons of a power and magnitude hitherto unknown in the history of aeronautics, in this or any other nation, I say, whether I look merely at home, or stretching my eyes farther, contemplate the boundless prospect of conquest and possession, achieved by British perseverance and British valor, which is outspread before me, I clasp my hands, and turning my eyes to the broad expanse above my head, exclaim, 'Thank heaven, I am a Briton.'" The time had been when this burst of enthusiasm would have been cheered to the very echo, but now the deputation received it with chilling coldness. The general impression seemed to be that as an explanation of Mr. Gregsbury's political conduct, it did not enter quite enough into detail, and one gentleman in the rear did not scruple to remark aloud that for his purpose it savored rather too much of a gammon tendency. "The meaning of that term, gammon," said Mr. Gregsbury, "is unknown to me. If it means that I grow a little too fervid, or perhaps even hyperbolical in extolling my native land, I admit the full justice of the remark. I am proud of this free and happy country. My form dilates, my eye glistens, my breast heaves and my heart swells, my bosom burns when I call to mind her greatness and her glory. "We wish, sir," remarked Mr. Pugstyles calmly, "to ask you a few questions." "If you please, gentlemen, my time is yours, and my country's." "And my country's," said Mr. Gregsbury. This permission being conceded, Mr. Pugstyles put on his spectacles, and referred to a written paper which he drew from his pocket, whereupon nearly every other member of the deputation pulled a written paper from his pocket to check Mr. Pugstyles off as he read the questions. This done, Mr. Pugstyles proceeded to business. Question number 1. Whether, sir, you did not give a voluntary pledge previous to your election that in event of your being returned, you would immediately put down the practice of coughing and groaning in the House of Commons, and whether you did not submit to be coughed and groaned down in the very first debate of the session, and have since made no effort to effect a reform in this respect. Whether you did not also pledge yourself to astonish the government and make them shrink in their shoes, and whether you have astonished them and made them shrink in their shoes or not. "Go on to the next one, my dear Pugstyles," said Mr. Gregsbury. "Have you any explanation to offer with reference to that question, sir?" asked Mr. Pugstyles. "Certainly not," said Mr. Gregsbury. The members of the deputation looked fiercely at each other, and afterwards at the member. Dear Pugstyles, having taken a very long stare at Mr. Gregsbury over the tops of his spectacles, resumed his list of inquiries. Question number 2. Whether, sir, you did not likewise give a voluntary pledge that you would support your colleague on every occasion, and whether you did not, the night before last, desert him and vote upon the other side, because the wife of a leader on that other side had invited Mrs. Gregsbury to an evening party. "Go on," said Mr. Gregsbury. "Nothing to say on that either, sir?" asked the spokesman. "Nothing whatever," replied Mr. Gregsbury. The deputation, who had only seen him at canvassing or election time, were struck dumb by his coolness. He didn't appear like the same man. Then he was all milk and honey. Now he was all starch and vinegar. But men are so different at different times. Question number 3, and last, said Mr. Pugstyles emphatically. Whether, sir, you did not state upon the hustings that it was your firm and determined intention to oppose everything proposed, to divide the House upon every question, to move for returns on every subject, to place a motion on the books every day, and in short, in your own memorable words, to play the very devil with everything and everybody. With this comprehensive inquiry, Mr. Pugstyles folded up his list of questions, as did all his backers. Mr. Gregsbury reflected, blew his nose, then himself further back in his chair, came forward again, leaning his elbows on the table, made a triangle with his 2 thumbs and his 2 forefingers, and tapping his nose with the apex thereof, replied, smiling as he said it, I deny everything. At this unexpected answer, a hoarse murmur arose from the deputation, and the same gentleman who had expressed an opinion relative to the gammoning nature of the introductory speech again made a monosyllabic demonstration by growling out, "Resign!" which growl, being taken up by his fellows, swelled into a very earnest and general remonstrance. I mean, that's not actually monosyllabic, but sure. I am requested, sir, to express a hope, said Mr. Pugstyles, with a distant bow, that on receiving a requisition to that effect from a great majority of your constituents, you will not object at once to resign your seat in favor of some candidate whom they think they can better trust. To this, Mr. Gregsbury read the following reply, which, anticipating the request, he had composed in the form of a letter, whereof copies had been made to send round to the newspapers. My dear Mr. Pugstyles, next to the welfare of our beloved island, this great and free and happy country, whose powers and resources are, I sincerely believe, illimitable, I value that noble independence which is an Englishman's proudest boast, and which I fondly hope to bequeath to my children, untarnished and unsullied. Actuated by no personal motives, but moved only by high and great constitutional considerations, which I will not attempt to explain, for they are really beneath the comprehension of those who have not made themselves masters, as I have, of the intricate and arduous study of politics, I would rather keep my seat, and intend doing so. Will you do me the favor to present my compliments to the constituent body, and acquaint them with this circumstance, With great esteem, my dear Mr. Pugstyles. Then you will not resign under any circumstances? Asked the spokesman. Mr. Gregsbury smiled and shook his head. Then good morning, sir, said Pugstyles angrily. Heaven bless you, said Mr. Gregsbury. And the deputation, with many growls and scowls, filed off as quickly as the narrowness of the staircase would allow of their getting down. The last man being gone, Mr. Gregsbury rubbed his hands and chuckled, as merry fellows will, when they think they have said or done a more than commonly good thing. He was so engrossed in this self-congratulation that he did not observe that Nicholas had been left behind in the shadow of the window curtains, until that young gentleman, fearing he might otherwise overhear some soliloquy intended to have no listeners, coughed twice or thrice to attract the member's notice. "What's that?" said Mr. Gregsbury in sharp accents. Nicholas stepped forward and bowed. "What do you do here, sir?" asked Mr. Gregsbury. "A spy upon my privacy? A concealed voter? You have heard my answer, sir. Pray follow the deputation." "I should have done so if I had belonged to it, but I do not," said Nicholas. "Then how came you here, sir?" was the natural inquiry of Mr. Gregsbury, M.P. "And where the devil have you come from, sir?" was the question which followed it. "I brought this card from the General Agency Office, sir," said Nicholas, "wishing to offer myself as your secretary, and understanding that you stood in need of one." "That's all you've come for, is it?" said Mr. Gregsbury, eyeing him in some doubt. Nicholas replied in the affirmative. "You have no connection with any of those rascally papers, have you?" said Mr. Gregsbury. "You didn't get into the room to hear what was going forward and put it in print, eh?" "I have no connection, I am sorry to say, with anything at present," rejoined Nicholas, politely enough, but quite at his ease. "Oh," said Mr. Gregsbury. "How did you find your way up here, then?" Nicholas related how he had been forced up by the deputation. "That was the way, was it?" said Mr. Gregsbury. "Sit down." Nicholas took a chair, and Mr. Gregsbury stared at him for a long time, as if to make certain, before he asked any further questions, that there were no objections to his outward appearance. "You want to be my secretary, do you?" he said at last. "I wish to be employed in that capacity, sir," replied Nicholas. "Well," said Mr. Gregsbury, "now what can you do?" "I suppose," replied Nicholas, smiling, "that I can do what usually falls to the lot of other secretaries." "What's that?" inquired Mr. Gregsbury. "What is it?" replied Nicholas. "Ah, what is it?" retorted the member, looking shrewdly at him, with his head on one side. "A secretary's duties are rather difficult to define, perhaps," said Nicholas, considering. "They include, I presume, correspondence." "Good," interposed Mr. Gregsbury. "The arrangement of papers and documents." "Very good. Occasionally, perhaps, the writing from your dictation, and possibly, sir," said Nicholas, with a half-smile, "the copying of your speech for some public journal when you have made one of more than usual importance." "Certainly," rejoined Mr. Gregsbury. "What else?" "Really," said Nicholas, after a moment's reflection, "I am not able, at this instant, to recapitulate any other duty of a secretary, beyond the general one of making himself as agreeable and useful to his employer as he can, consistently with his own respectability, and without overstepping that line of duties which he undertakes to perform, and which the designation of his office is usually understood to imply." Mr. Gregsbury looked fixedly at Nicholas for a short time, and then glancing warily round the room, said in a suppressed voice, "This is all very well, Mr. What is your name? Nickleby. This is all very well, Mr. Nickleby, and very proper so far as it goes. So far as it goes, but it doesn't go far enough. There are other duties, Mr. Nickleby, which a secretary to a parliamentary gentleman must never lose sight of. I should require to be crammed, sir." "I beg your pardon," interposed Nicholas, doubtful whether he had heard aright. "To be crammed, sir," repeated Mr. Gregsbury. "May I beg your pardon again, if I inquire what you mean, sir?" said Nicholas. "My meaning, sir, is perfectly plain," replied Mr. Gregsbury with a solemn aspect. "My secretary would have to make himself master of the foreign policy of the world, as it is mirrored in the newspapers, to run his eye over all accounts of public meetings, all leading articles and accounts of the proceedings of public bodies, and to make notes of anything which it appeared to him might be made a point of, in any little speech upon the question of some petition lying on the table, or anything of that kind. Do you understand?" I think I do, sir, replied Nicholas. Then, said Mr. Gregsbury, it would be necessary for him to make himself acquainted from day to day with newspaper paragraphs on passing events, such as mysterious disappearance and supposed suicide of a pot-boy, or anything of that sort, upon which I might found a question to the Secretary of State for the Home Department. Then he would have to copy the question, and as much as I remembered of the answer, including a little compliment about independence and good sense, and to send the manuscript in a frank to the local paper, with perhaps half a dozen lines of leader to the effect that I was always to be found in my place in Parliament, and never shrunk from the responsible and arduous duties, and so forth. You see? Nicholas bowed. Besides which, continued Mr. Gregsbury, I should expect him, now and then, to go through a few figures in the printed tables, and to pick out a few results, so that I might come out pretty well on timber duty questions and finance questions and so on, and I should like him to get up a few little arguments about the disastrous effects of a return to cash payments and a metallic currency, with a touch now and then about the exportation of bullion and the Emperor of Russia and banknotes and all that kind of thing, which it's only necessary to talk fluently about, because nobody understands it. Do you take me? I think I understand, said Nicholas. With regard to such questions as are not political, continued Mr. Gregsbury, warming, and which one can't be expected to care a curse about, beyond the natural care of not allowing inferior people to be as well off as ourselves, else where are our privileges? I should wish my secretary to get together a few little flourishing speeches of a patriotic cast. For instance, if any preposterous bill were brought forward for giving poor grubbing devils of authors a right to their own property, I should like to say that I, for one, would never consent to opposing an insurmountable bar to the diffusion of literature among the people. You understand? Wow, this is definitely not a comment from the author on any piece of legislation, is it? That the creations of the pocket, being man's, might belong to one man or one family, but that the creations of the brain, being God's, ought, as a matter of course, to belong to the people at large. And if I was pleasantly disposed, I should like to make a joke about posterity, and to say that those who wrote for posterity should be content to be rewarded by the approbation of posterity. It might take with the house, and could never do me any harm, because posterity can't be expected to know anything about me or my jokes either. Do you see? I see that, sir, replied Nicholas. You must always bear in mind, in such cases as this, where our interests are not affected, said Mr. Gregsbury, to put it very strong about the people, because it comes out very well at election time, and you could be as funny as you liked about the authors, because I believe the greater part of them live in lodgings and are not voters. This is a hasty outline of the chief things you'd have to do, except waiting in the lobby every night, in case I forgot anything, and should want fresh cramming, and now and then, during great debates, sitting in the front row of the gallery and saying to the people about, "You see that gentleman, with his hand to his face and his arm twisted round the pillar? That's Mr. Gregsbury, the celebrated Mr. Gregsbury," with any other little eulogium that might strike you at the moment. "And for salary," said Mr. Gregsbury, winding up with great rapidity, for he was out of breath. "And for salary, I don't mind saying at once in round numbers, to prevent any dissatisfaction, though it's more than I've been accustomed to give, 15 shillings a week, and find yourself there." With this handsome offer, Mr. Gregsbury once more threw himself back in his chair, and looked like a man who had been most profligately liberal, but is determined not to repent of it notwithstanding. 15 shillings a week is not much, said Nicholas mildly. "Not much? 15 shillings a week, not much, young man," cried Mr. Gregsbury. 15 shillings a—" "Pray do not suppose that I quarrel with the sum, sir," replied Nicholas, "for I am not ashamed to confess that whatever it may be in itself, to me it is a great deal. But the duties and responsibilities make the recompense small, and they are so very heavy that I fear to undertake them." "Do you decline to undertake them, sir?" inquired Mr. Gregsbury, with his hand on the bell-rope. "I fear they are too great for my powers, however good my will may be, sir," replied Nicholas. "That is as much to say that you would rather not accept the place, and that you consider 15 shillings a week too little," said Mr. Gregsbury, ringing. "Do you decline it, sir?" I have no alternative but to do so, replied Nicholas. Door, Matthews, said Mr. Gregsbury as the boy appeared. I am sorry I have troubled you unnecessarily, sir, said Nicholas. I am sorry you have, rejoined Mr. Gregsbury, turning his back upon him. Door, Matthews. Good morning, sir, said Nicholas. Door, Matthews, cried Mr. Gregsbury. The boy beckoned Nicholas, and tumbling lazily downstairs before him, opened the door, and ushered him into the street. With a sad and pensive air, he retraced his steps homeward. Smike had scraped a meal together from the remnant of last night's supper, and was anxiously awaiting his return. The occurrences of the morning had not improved Nicholas's appetite, and by him the dinner remained untasted. He was sitting in a thoughtful attitude, with the plate which the poor fellow had assiduously filled with the choicest morsels untouched by his side, when Newman Noggs looked into the room. Come back? Asked Newman. Yes, replied Nicholas. Tired to death, and what is worse, might have remained at home for all the good I've done. Couldn't expect to do much in one morning, said Newman. Maybe so, but I am sanguine and did expect, said Nicholas, and am proportionally disappointed. Saying which, he gave Newman an account of his proceedings. If I could do anything, said Nicholas, anything, however slight, until Ralph Nickleby returns, and I have eased my mind by confronting him, I should feel happier. I should think it no disgrace to work, heaven knows. Lying indolently here like a half-tamed sullen beast distracts me. I don't know, said Newman. Small things offer. They would pay the rent and more, but you wouldn't like them. No, you could hardly be expected to undergo it. No. What could I hardly be expected to undergo? Said Nicholas, raising his eyes. Show me, in this wide waste of London, any honest means by which I could even defray the weekly hire of this poor room, and see if I shrink from resorting to them. Undergo. I've undergone too much, my friend, to feel pride or squeamishness now. Except, added Nicholas hastily, after a short silence, except such squeamishness as is common honesty, and so much pride as constitutes self-respect. I see little to choose between assistant to a brutal pedagogue, and toad-eater to a mean and ignorant upstart, be he member or no member. I hardly know whether I should tell you what I heard this morning or not, said Newman. Has it reference to what you said just now? Asked Nicholas. It has. Then in heaven's name, my good friend, tell it me, said Nicholas. For God's sake, consider my deplorable condition, and while I promise to take no step without taking counsel with you, give it at least a vote in my own behalf. Moved by this entreaty, Newman stammered forth a variety of most unaccountable and entangled sentences, the upshot of which was that Mrs. Kinnewiggs had examined him at great length that morning, touching the origin of his acquaintance with and the whole life, adventures, and pedigree of Nicholas, that Newman had parried these questions as long as he could, but being at length hard-pressed and driven into a corner, had gone so far as to admit that Nicholas was a tutor of great accomplishments, involved in some misfortunes which he was not at liberty to explain, and bearing the name of Johnson. That Mrs. Kinnewiggs, impelled by gratitude or ambition, or maternal pride or maternal love, or all four powerful motives conjointly, had taken secret conference with Mr. Kinnewiggs, and had finally returned to propose that Mr. Johnson should instruct the four Miss Kinwiggses in the French language as spoken by natives, at the weekly stipend of 5 shillings, current coin of the realm, being at the rate of 1 shilling per week, per each Miss Kinwiggs, and 1 shilling over until such time as the baby might be able to take it out in grammar. Which, unless I am very much mistaken, observed Miss Kinnewiggs in making the proposition, will not be very long for such clever children. Mr. Noggs were never born into the world, I do believe. There, said Newman, that's all. It's beneath you, I know, but I thought that perhaps you might. Might, cried Nicholas with great alacrity. Of course I shall. I accept the offer at once. Tell the worthy mother so, without delay, my dear fellow, and that I am ready to begin whenever she pleases. Newman hastened, with joyful steps, to inform Mrs. Kinnewiggs of his friend's acquiescence, and soon returning, brought back word that they would be happy to see him in the first floor as soon as convenient, that Mrs. Kinnywiggs had, upon the instant, sent out to secure a second-hand French grammar and dialogues, which had long been fluttering in the sixpenny box at the bookstall round the corner, and that the family, highly excited at the prospect of this addition to their gentility, wished the initiatory lesson to come off immediately. And here it may be observed that Nicholas was not, in the ordinary sense of the word, a young man of high spirit. He would resent an affront to himself, or interpose to redress a wrong offered to another, as boldly and freely as any knight that ever set lance in rest. But he lacked that peculiar excess of coolness and great-minded selfishness which invariably distinguish gentlemen of high spirit. In truth, for our own part, we are disposed to look upon such gentlemen as being rather encumbrances than otherwise in rising families, happening to be acquainted with several whose spirit prevents their settling down to any groveling occupation, and only displays itself in a tendency to cultivate mustachios and look fierce. And although mustachios and ferocity are both very pretty things in their way, and very much to be commended, we confess to a desire to see them bred at the owner's proper cost, rather than at the expense of low-spirited people. Nicholas, therefore, not being a high-spirited young man, according to common parlance, and deeming it a greater degradation to borrow, for the supply of his necessities, from Newman Noggs than to teach French to the little Kinwiggses for 5 shillings a week, accepted the offer with the alacrity already described, and betook himself to the first floor with all convenient speed. Here he was received by Mrs. Kinwiggs with a genteel air, kindly intended to assure him of her protection and support. And here, too, he found Mr. Lillyvick and Miss Petoker, the 4 Miss Kinwiggses on their form of audience, and the baby in a dwarf porter's chair with a deal tray before it, amusing himself with a toy horse without a head, the said horse being composed of a small wooden cylinder, not unlike an Italian iron, supported on 4 crooked pegs, and painted in ingenious resemblance of red wafers set in blacking. "How do you do, Mr. Johnson?" said Mrs. Kinnywiggs. "Uncle, Mr. Johnson." "How do you do, sir?" said Mr. Lillyvick, rather sharply, for he had not known what Nicholas was on the previous night, and it was rather an aggravating circumstance if a tax collector had been too polite to a teacher. "Mr. Johnson is engaged as private master to the children, uncle," said Mrs. Kinwiggs. "So you said just now, my dear," replied Mr. Lillyvick. "But I hope," said Mrs. Kinwiggs, drawing herself up, that will not make them proud, but that they will bless their good fortune, which has borne them superior to common people's children. Do you hear, Morlina?" "Yes, ma," replied Miss Kinwiggs. "And when you go out in the streets or elsewhere, I desire that you don't boast of it to the other children," said Mrs. Kinwiggs, "and that if you must say anything about it, you don't say no more than, 'We've got a private master comes to teach us at home, but we ain't proud because ma says it's sinful.' Do you hear, Morlina?" "Yes, ma," replied Miss Kinwiggs again. "Then mind you recollect and do as I tell you," said Miss Kinwiggs. "Shall Mr. Johnson begin, uncle?" "I am ready to hear if Mr. Johnson is ready to commence, my dear," said the collector, assuming the air of a profound critic. "What sort of language do you consider French, sir?" "How do you mean?" asked Nicholas. "Do you consider it a good language, sir?" said the collector. "A pretty language, a sensible language?" "A pretty language, certainly," replied Nicholas. "And as it has a name for everything and admits of elegant conversation about everything, I presume it is a sensible one." "I don't know," said Mr. Lillyvick doubtfully. "Do you call it a cheerful language now?" "Yes," replied Nicholas. "I should say it was, certainly." "It's very much changed since my time, then," said the collector. "Very much." "Was it a dismal one in your time?" asked Nicholas, scarcely able to repress a smile. "Very," replied Mr. Lillyvick, with some vehemence of manner. "It's the war time that I speak of, the last war. It may be a cheerful language. I should be very sorry to contradict anybody, but I can only say that I have heard the French prisoners, who were natives, and ought to know how to speak it, talking in such a dismal manner, that it made one miserable to hear them. Aye, that I have, 50 times, sir, 50 times." Mr. Lillyvick was waxing so cross that Mrs. Kinwiggs thought it expedient to motion to Nicholas not to say anything. And it was not until Miss Petoker had practiced several blandishments to soften the excellent old gentleman that he deigned to break silence by asking, What's the water in French, sir? L'eau, replied Nicholas. Ah, said Mr. Lillyvick, shaking his head mournfully. I thought as much. L'eau, eh? I don't think anything of that language. Nothing at all. I suppose the children may begin, uncle, said Mrs. Kenwigs. Oh, yes, they may begin, my dear, replied the collector, discontentedly. I have no wish to prevent them. This permission being conceded, the four Miss Kenwigses sat in a row, with their tails one way and Morlena at the top, while Nicholas, taking the book, began his preliminary explanations. Miss Petoker and Mrs. Kenwigs looked on in silent admiration, broken only by the whispered assurances of the latter that Morlena would have it all by heart in no time, and Mr. Lillyvick regarded the group with frowning and attentive eyes, lying in wait for something upon which he could open a fresh discussion on the language. All right. Let's go ahead and end things there. I know we're about 20 minutes out from the usual end, but that's the end of the chapter, and the next starts back with the sister as the point of view character. So it's a good transition point, I think. And I don't think we'd be able to finish that next chapter before the end of the stream. So I think we'll close there. Thank you, everyone, for joining me for the story this evening. I hope everyone's having a wonderful evening and that you enjoyed the reading. Woulda, coulda, shoulda, what? Oh, do you want to chat for a bit before we look for somebody to raid? I'm good. I'm good with that. We can do that. Oh, man. Memories of job interviews. Yeah, I've actually had an interview kind of like the one that Nickleby experienced, where they wanted to pay nothing but wanted you to do all the things. It was actually at a cinema. In theory, it was a management position, but they were paying as little as possible, but they also wanted you to be IT for the business and to manage all the social media and all the software for the back office, all the tech, all the gear, everything, in addition to managing staff and scheduling and all that, and paid you about as much as the person working the register and restocking the snacks. Oh, so you were on the other side, Zippy? Okay. Although I'm assuming you paid rather better than Mr. Gregsbury. Yeah. One thing kind of tickled me in that conversation with Mr. Gregsbury. It's it's a lesson that I taught my kid, that the first priority and obligation of anybody when they acquire power is to retain that power, to stay in power. Now, whether that motivation is positive or negative varies from person to person, whether it's because they think that the potential replacement would, not care as much or be as capable or whatnot, or whether they want power for its own sake and their personal advancement. But whatever the motivation behind it, the priority is always to maintain their power. So I thought it was kind of funny. I mean, I can't fault that. Get paid when you're supposed to. clearly defined responsibilities and you shared the rewards with them. That's it's about as much as you can ask, really. It's better than a lot of employments I've had. You sold cars? I didn't know that. Oh, okay. So what does a lot tech do? I'm not familiar with the term. Also, Vela, you are doing a terrible job of chatting here. You're being very quiet. Shame, shame. Little thief. Yeah. I can converse with you too. Worst case, I can always just like scroll up and catch anything I miss. I mean, that's the great thing about you guys being in text and me being on voice is, you know, I can pause and scroll you guys as I like, right? It's not quite the same as if everybody's in voice and talking over each other and interrupting and mic feedback and all that stuff. So please do. My dog, when I was a kid, she was upstairs in the house and I was downstairs, and I had the audacity to lower a bar of candy to waist level. And the next thing I knew, the dog had streaked through the house, snatched the candy from my hand, and was back up the stairs, and the candy bar had disappeared into the dog. Like, fastest I had ever did not say that the dog was a streaker. Tisk tisk. But fastest I ever saw that dog move. Never saw her go that fast before. It was hilarious. Replay. Next thing I know, that's going to end up on the quote bot. She was. My parents decided to breed her against my wishes, and she hemorrhaged and passed away as a result of the breeding, and the puppies all passed as well. So sad times. Good dog, sad times. But that was a long time ago in a faraway place. What were the other things on the plate? Kana doesn't like green things. It doesn't much matter what they are. Now, she'll be really excited if I have any food whatsoever of any kind, and she'll beg and she'll plead. But if I toss her like a piece of vegetable or something like that, she'll catch it, immediately spit it out, and then look at me with this utterly betrayed picture, like expression on her face. Just like, how could you? That was a green thing. Oh. Connor really likes chips. It's like the one if the vegetable's been deep fried she'll go for it. But not if it's a fresh vegetable or steamed or cooked or anything like that. Deep fried is okay though. She does not deserve steak all day every day. No way. She's a stinker. Maybe not as much of a stinker as your dog. Vella's dog conducts chemical warfare on her on the daily. At least from what I've been told. I think she'd just beg, period. Oh. That's right. After the stream, I gotta see about posting some pictures of her with her drooling and her little tear in her eye, begging for breakfast. I may indulge her more than I should. Well, why don't we find somebody to raid? I've been doing raids, and we've actually picked up a few followers. Although, I'm not sure how much that's translated to viewers. People following is great, but I like you guys actually like participating and being a part of the streams and chatting, and watching the VODs and that sort of thing. Followers is mostly a proxy for that. If people interact. Let's see. Well, we kind of have to raid Meg since she's streaming, and she's streaming Among Us. So maybe we'll raid her and then jump in on a game or two and stabby. You guys down for some Among Us? Yes, she is mature rated, and the language is a little more adult than what I use most of the time. But she has been like a huge help to me with the streaming and everything, so I'm pretty grateful to her. But let's go raid Megster this time. We did art streams the last couple. Let's do a gaming one this time. And away we go. All right, I think we can still hear me. Have an excellent evening. I'm going to close this out.